Welcome to episode 19 of Japan Foundation's Pop Culture Series. I'm Sukiya Mio from Japan Foundation's New York office with my arts and culture team. In this episode, we will explore the world of Japanese manga and anime legend, Leiji Matsumoto, who passed away last year. His iconic works such as Space Battleship Yamato and Galaxy Express 39 led the unprecedented anime boom in the 1970s in Japan, and it brought about an era in which anime was no longer just for children, but for adults. And not just in Japan, once Star Blazers, the adaptation of Space Battleship Yamato, was aired in the United States in 1979, it even created the first wave of anime fandom in America. Those in their 20s or 30s watching this might have never watched or read his works, but I'm sure that you have watched anime heavily influenced by them. Today, we have 4 Leiji Matsumoto experts to discuss the legacy. We put together a crash course on Matsumoto to bring you up to speed on his legacy and give you an in-depth understanding of the universal appeal and essence of the Matsumoto style. Our first speaker is Mr. Tim Eldred.
Hello, everyone.
Hi. He is a professional comic book creator and a storyboard artist and director in TV animation. In addition to his own creations, he has worked on several major properties in comic books and animation, including Matsumoto's Captain Harlock and Star Blazers. Tim has also maintained the website Cosmo DNA as the internet's most comprehensive English language archive for Star Blazers and Space Battleship Yamato. Today, he will give us a short presentation about how Matsumoto's manga and anime were created and what the essence of the Matsumoto style is. Our second speaker is Dr. Deborah Shamoon from the National University of Singapore.
Hello.
Hi. Her areas of expertise are Japanese literature, film, and popular culture, particularly manga and animation. Her research focuses on representations of girls and young women in Japanese media from the 1920s to the present day. Today, her short presentation will cover the early career of Matsumoto. Our third speaker is Dr. Darren-Jon Ashmore from Yamanashi Gakuin University in Japan.
Morning, everyone, or evening.
So he is award-winning writer, translator, actor, and anthropologist. He co-edited the first book on Matsumoto in English, Matsumoto Leiji, A Life in Art. Today, he will moderate the later discussion and give us a short presentation about the philosophical basis of Matsumoto's works. Our fourth speaker is Mr. Zack Davisson.
Hello.
He is an award-winning translator, writer, and a folklorist. He has translated many of Leiji Matsumoto's mangas, including Queen Emeraldus, Captain Harlock, and Space Battleship Yamato. Today, he will give us a short presentation about what it was like to translate Matsumoto's work. We'll begin our program with short pre-recorded presentations from each guest speaker. After, they will engage in a live discussion and a Q&A session. So please feel free to comment or ask questions in the live chat. While we have already received a lot of questions from registrants in advance, we will try to answer as many of your questions as possible. Now let's move on to the presentations, starting with Tim. I will return later for the Q&A session. See you later! Puchi.
Is this the first Leiji Matsumoto work you saw? Or was it this one? Or maybe this one? Or was it one of these? If so, it's my duty as a fellow fan to tell you that these were not made by Leiji Matsumoto. You probably knew that to some degree, since animation is, by definition, a collaborative art form made by a lot of people. For example, mecha designers, and character designers, and scriptwriters. Working as a production unit, They become interpreters. Their job is to transform ideas into a finished form. Let's take a look at how they did it and see if we can find what role Leiji Matsumoto actually played in all this. My name is Tim Eldred. I'm a professional comic book artist and TV animation director. One of the reasons I followed that career path was the inspiration I drew from Leiji Matsumoto's works. This is where it started for me. Star Blazers was the English version of space battleship Yamato, which was originally made in 1974 and came to English-speaking audiences 5 years later. Star Blazers led me back to its source material. After I saw Yamato, I did what most other fans my age did. I tracked down more Leiji Matsumoto anime. That led me to Captain Harlock, Galaxy Express 999, Queen Millennia, and many others. There was a Matsumoto boom in the late 70s and early 80s that brought many of his titles to animation. After a lull of about 10 years, a smaller boom happened in the 90s, when Matsumoto anime was revived with sequels and other projects. He achieved international fame when he was invited by Daft Punk to collaborate on a long-form music video titled Interstella 5555. What do you notice as we skim through these later works? They become increasingly interpretive, some more than others. For example, let's take a look at one of the best-known films, My Youth in Arcadia, also known as Arcadia of My Youth, released in 1982. Here's what Captain Harlock looked like straight from the pen of Leiji Matsumoto. Here's what he looked like from character designer Kazuo Komatsubara. In The Cockpit, a series released in 1993, the character design was shared by 3 artists: Hironobu Saito, Toshihiro Kawamoto, and Yoshiaki Kawajiri. Then in 1998, a new Galaxy Express film added a new name to the roster: character designer Keisuke Masunaga. From that point on, he became the go-to designer for almost all Matsumoto anime projects, including Queen Emeraldus, Cosmo Warrior Zero, Gun Frontier, and others. Masunaga's work also became the basis for the Galaxy Railways in 2003, with character designs by Fuminori Kizaki and Itsuko Takeda. So if these modern works are getting more interpretive, what if we go back to the early ones? Let's start with the first Matsumoto anime I saw, Space Battleship Yamato. Leiji Matsumoto participated heavily as a writer, designer, and storyboard artist. How much of his style did we see on the screen? Here are some of his character design concepts. And here are the production designs by Nobuhiro Okasuko. Again, we see that they are interpretations. This is a necessary part of the process, since an army of animators needs a common reference point. What about the mecha? Here are some of Leiji Matsumoto's concept drawings, and here are the finished production designs by Studio Nui. These served the animators in the same way Okasuko's character designs did. Space Battleship Yamato may not be the best place to look for a pure Matsumoto style. After all, it was an original story created by a team of writers instead of a Leiji Matsumoto manga. He did draw a Yamato manga, but it was based on the anime rather than the other way around. What if we look at an early Matsumoto anime series that was based on his manga? We have 2 prime candidates for this: Space Pirate Captain Harlock and Galaxy Express, both of which premiered on TV in 1978. Now we're getting closer to the source. Why? Because these 2 fell into a sweet spot. Matsumoto was already a rising star in the manga world before Yamato. Afterward, he was boosted into even greater fame, giving him much more creative authority. As a result, these 2 shows delivered the purest version of his work in anime form. But we're not quite there yet. Just like Yamato, they were subject to a production process, designs had to be locked down, interpreted, for another army of animators. Space Pirates character designer was Kazuo Komatsubara. The Galaxy Express character designs were by Shigeru Kogawa and Shingo Araki. All this brings us to an inevitable conclusion. If you want to explore the pure, undiluted Leiji Matsumoto style, anime is not where you'll find it. Instead, you have to turn to manga. Even here, we have to proceed with caution. To explain why, take some insider talk about how manga is produced. In America, the division of labor on a comic book usually goes as follows: penciler, inker, letterer, and colorist. In Japan, there is usually also a division of labor in manga. But here it's based on specialty. Some artists might specialize in cars, others in airplanes, others in backgrounds, and on and on. Together they share the workload as a studio. That's what allows some manga to be published weekly. Leiji Matsumoto also employed a studio of artists for manga production. For example, Kaoru Shintani was really good at drawing airplanes. He would go on to create his own series, Area 88. Katsumi Itabashi was really good at drawing sci-fi mecha. He was heavily involved in the design and rendering of spaceships and perfected the famous Matsumoto meters that became an iconic part of the style. Here's an example of a lesser-known assistant named Hiroshi Aizawa. If you look very closely at this page from a Space Battleship Yamato manga, you can see slight differences in how the characters are drawn. These are Matsumoto drawings. These are Aizawa drawings. This becomes easier to identify when you look at Aizawa's solo work on another Yamato manga published a few years later. There was a time before Leiji Matsumoto was prosperous enough to afford a studio of assistants, and when we look back at the manga from this time, we finally see the unfiltered version of his work. It doesn't look much like the other art we've seen, does it? But here's the thing. For his entire career, Leiji Matsumoto never stood still. He was always evolving, always moving from one genre to another, always finding a new way to express himself. I had the honor of meeting him in person for an interview back in 2010. On that occasion, I asked him which project he felt was his most personal, and his answer surprised me. It was Otoko Oidon, which he created in 1971. Most of us know Matsumoto for far-flung sci-fi space opera, but this was as far from that as you could get. It's the story of a modern lowlife, a young man struggling to get by on the bottom rung of society. It serves as an inflection point, the very beginning of the Leiji Matsumoto we would meet afterward. It didn't so much set the visual tone for the worlds he would go on to create, but it established the type of people who lived in those worlds, doing their best to survive there. What shall we conclude from this? What exactly is pure Matsumoto style? The answer is all of it. It is both the work of one man and the work of a collective. It is the vision of one man evolved over decades to the point where others began interpreting it for a much wider audience. The purity of the visuals is a phantom. We can chase it all our lives and never catch it. Instead, the purity is in the vision, which could not have been created by anyone other than Leiji Matsumoto.
Today about the early career of Matsumoto Leiji. So he was born Matsumoto Akira in 1938 in Kyushu. He started using the pen name Leiji around the 1960s. Matsumoto started drawing manga at the age of 6, and these are some examples of his childish work that he did for his own amusement. In high school, he joined the manga club in Kyushu, which published a magazine of members' works, and these are some examples of the works that he did for that magazine. In 1954, he won a newcomer's prize in the magazine Manga Shonen for Mitsubachi no Boken, or Honeybee's Adventures. But this wasn't an ongoing contract as he had hoped. Matsumoto was always the most interested in creating science fiction manga, but he wasn't able to break into the industry right away. So from 1957 to 1969, he published primarily in shoujo manga, or magazines for girls. In the 1960s, the shoujo manga genre was not fixed the way that it is today. That didn't happen until the early 1970s. So it was a bit easier to get published in shoujo manga because there was more flexibility in genre expectations. And many male writers published in shoujo in the 1960s, including Ishinomori Shotaro, Umezu Kazuo, Chiba Tetsuya, and Fujiko Fujio. So these are some examples of Matsumoto's shoujo manga. In 1962, he married Maki Miyako, and she was a major shoujo manga artist of the 1960s. This is an example of her work. She helped to define the big-eyed shoujo style and the emphasis on fashion and elaborate decorative panel layouts that we now associate with shoujo manga. She was also the designer of the Rika-chan doll that is kind of the Japanese version of Barbie. But Matsumoto felt that he couldn't connect with female readers, so much of his work in the 1960s was in illustrating fairy tales, and these stories were aimed at very young readers. So in terms of his contributions to shoujo manga, Matsumoto didn't really change the genre that much. His first big breakout hit series was not in shoujo manga or in science fiction, but actually in the slice of life genre. And this series was his first big breakout hit. The title is Otoko Oidon, which is Kyushu dialect for I Am a Man. It was published in Weekly Shonen Magazine from 1971 to 1973. This series is dark humor, a somewhat autobiographical satire about a loser, a guy who can't keep a job or stay in school. And there's a lot of gross out humor, very silly scenes, and the main character is depicted as kind of pathetic. But Matsumoto felt that this was the first time that he connected with readers in an authentic way, because he revealed personal anxieties about failure, about moments of social embarrassment and humiliation, and readers could really relate to this. We can also see in this series his typical character design that he becomes known for. So caricatures of men who are depicted as very small and almost grotesque, and idealized very tall, willowy women. So after his success in this series, in 1974, Matsumoto was brought onto the team that was working on the anime series Space Battleship Yamato, or Uchu Senkan Yamato. This was produced by Nishizaki Yoshinobu. This series had been in development for some time already, but some team members had left for other projects. So Matsumoto was brought in as a director, and he revamped the whole series. This space opera is an anti-war, pro-environmental story, and it's about a young, inexperienced crew needing to learn to work together. And if this plot sounds familiar, it's because it inspired many, many anime sci-fi series that came after it. And yet, even though it is an anti-war story, it still has many echoes of World War II era militarism in it. So Yamato is an ancient name for Japan, or part of Japan. And it was also the name of a World War II era battleship that led the fleet during the war, but was sunk in 1945. And this spaceship in the anime series is the original battleship Yamato itself. And in the early scenes of the anime, we see it rising up from the ocean, rebuilt as a spaceship. Also, the theme song in the anime series is in the style of gunka, or military propaganda songs. The uniform that the characters wear is partly inspired by the Shinsengumi. That was the militia at the end of the Edo period that protected the shogun, that was trying to maintain the feudal order. Now, this contradiction of anti-war anime containing militaristic themes occurs in many other series, such as Mobile Suit Gundam. It's a problem that Matsumoto was aware of. And it's a problem that occurs in pretty much every anti-war anime or live-action film. It's very difficult to depict scenes of battle without also making them spectacular and somewhat idealized. Now, the other topic that I want to talk to you about today is Matsumoto's representation of female characters. So all of his female characters have a distinctive, iconic look that we see here. And this is quite different from the female character design now preferred by male otaku, but, fashions change over time. Matsumoto is celebrated for creating strong female characters, and we see 3 examples of that here. Meiteru from Galaxy Express 999, Queen Emeraldis, who began as a character in the series Captain Harlock, which some of the other presenters will talk about in more detail, and Queen Millennia. So all of these characters are the main characters in their series, and they are very powerful and they have agency. And perhaps for this reason, Matsumoto has a lot of female fans. But we also have to recognize that even these characters are sexualized. They're frequently shown nude and in sexualized costumes. And many, many of his characters are also female stereotypes. So this is just one example from Space Battleship Yamato. Yuki is the only female member of the crew on the Yamato. Even though she is a member of the bridge crew, she is also responsible for stereotypically feminine tasks, including serving the rest of the crew food, serving as a nurse for the rest of the crew, and even doing the laundry for the male crew members. She's also subject to harassment that's played for laughs, as we see in this screenshot here. And it's not just Yuki. Pretty much all of the female characters appear nude or nearly nude, either in the series itself or in the advertising art, and especially in the manga. Because there's less censorship of the manga and they can aim at an adult audience, there is much more nudity and sexualized representation of female characters in the manga and sexist behavior by the male characters. Now, this is a pervasive problem in anime, but Matsumoto is not exempt from it. And we even see this in his series Otoko Oidon, where the women are all objects of male fantasy, and at the bottom of the page here, we see one of the characters appearing nude. Nevertheless, Matsumoto has had many female fans, and I was one of them. So just to talk a little bit about my own personal experience, Space Battleship Yamato was broadcast in the United States in 1979, and the series Captain Harlock and Queen Millennia were recombined into a rewritten series and also screened in the United States in the 1980s. And I grew up watching both of these series when I was in elementary school in New England. And I was a big fan of them. I watched every episode over and over again. In high school, I joined my local cartoon fantasy organization, which was pretty much the first fan organization for anime fans in the United States. And they held monthly screenings where we would gather to watch hours and hours of VHS tapes of anime that had been pirated and brought over from Japan. These tapes had no subtitles. If we were lucky, maybe we would get a brief summary of what the series was about, but otherwise we just had to guess as we were watching it untranslated in Japanese. And this was really the only way that we could have access to anime aside from what was broadcast on television. Also, I discovered that a local toy store in my area was selling imported Japanese models, and they also had Japanese books for sale. And so I bought many, many copies of the art books about Space Battleship Yamato, even though they were written in Japanese and I couldn't read them. So from this fandom, I started learning Japanese in high school, then later continued in university, and then on to graduate school. And my career, getting a PhD in Japanese studies and becoming a scholar, begins with Matsumoto and Space Battleship Yamato. Thank you.
Please excuse the picture. Please excuse the sound. My name is Darren Ashmore. I teach anthropology and popular culture studies at Yamanashi Gakuin University's School of Liberal Arts. It's my job today to discuss a little more about the philosophical basis of Master Leiji's works. Before I do, however, I would like to acknowledge one person who is often left out of discussions of the Leijiverse, and that is Maki Miyako Sensei, our master's wife and confidant, advisor and friend for decades, from the time when they lived as young illustrators in that great commune in Tokyo to the sad day on which he died. Her influence on the Leijiverse cannot be underplayed. Actually, this is especially true because when they started to work together, the comic industry as a whole was in something of a flux. Whilst Miyako Sensei was laying out what would become some of the prime elements of classical shoujo manga in her own work, she was helping Matsumoto Akira at that time to look at the work he was doing within shoujo manga as more than just simple romance. The title I've picked here as an example, Gin no Tani no Maria, Maria of the Silver Valley, is a work which absolutely demonstrates his, whatever you want to call it, attempt to make more of media. When Matsumoto Sensei was given the brief for this comic, it was originally just to be a simple historical romance. The sort of thing that was 10 a penny in the middle of the 1950s. But this was an opportunity they both felt to do something greater, to take comics in a more adventurous direction. After all, to throw in high strangeness and Fortean drama like Laplomb's Lost Kingdom of Mu, to bring in almost time travel elements, adventure and warfare, the throwing down of the gods and the implacability of mountains. This is a small title that, just like Shin Takarajima did for Master Tezuka in 1949, this title did for Matsumoto Sensei. Though it's hard to find today, even in Japanese, it is a title that has all the stamps of what we now call the Leijiverse. Adventure, mythic characters, a rolling sense of time, and the notion that, well, people can be more than we think they are. Now, how this connects to the Leijiverse proper, well, that's where we come to another little title. I don't want to spend too much on Maria, because where our tale takes off is another lesser known comic, and it's in this almost unknown outside of the fan we discover more of the master's mind, more of Master Leiji's, more of Master Miyako's iconoclastic and libertarian ideals. And it's here we find the root of the philosophy, the ring of time, the toki no wa, which is so important to almost every work. The comic is Miraiza Ban, the story of an individual drawn into a world of time travel and, what can we call them, perpetual beings known as Miraizas, perhaps drawn from the root word mirai, meaning the future. Creatures who carry a form of almost celestial memory, which echoes the past and foreshadows the future. They are beings of essence, like the Norns of Nordic myth, and they observe and influence for good or for ill, almost all of the innumerable rings of time on which the Leiji verse came to be constructed. It's a small comic, it's a simple one, and again, it has not been translated. I despair at this fact. It has been used again and again by the master in his own works, turning his Wagnerian ideals, his Nordic readings of the cyclic nature of time, creating vessels through which gods and heroes and space pirates begin and end their lives in a constant circle of destruction and rebuilding, whether personal or universal. Master Leiji's ultimate take on this would be his interlinking and often very different versions of his main characters down through the years, his new Valhallan gods, if you will, each one serving as a paragon for the age or the time or the place in which they reside in print or on celluloid. How many Harlocks have there been, for example? How many Methodus? How many Tetsuros? How many Prometheans? And how many dedicated fans have attempted to create all manner of concordance of the master's work, only to come up short amid a sea of entanglements? It is a wonderful thing. I too became frustrated by this issue, and when interviewing the master, every single time I tried to sneak in questions as to how Tokinowa actually worked. And every time I did, he always denied me a broader understanding of the art, saying simply, "What do you think?" And when I told him, he would nod sagely and say, "If that's what you think, then that's what you think. For now." Before I discovered Miraizaban, I did consider that the master was simply rebooting a lot of his works as required, or experimenting with what-if scenarios for his cast of characters. But the more I consider Idaiban's discovery as his own role as a perpetual, with the ability to look in to timelines and identify people, it made me realize that all of Master Leiji's rings were linked. That was the first great ring in my head. They were all linked, each story one to the other, overlapping and eternal. Toku toki no wa sessuru tokuro de mata ao. Far off, where the rings of time touch once more, we shall meet. This is the core of it. You'll hear it uttered again and again, and see it written again and again by those who live in the rings of time. Harlock, Maya, Yuki, Emeraldas, Tochiro, Meteru, Tetsuro, Promethean, and all the other heroes and villains. Perhaps aware of their nature as perpetuals, perhaps not. Nevertheless, we as Miraizers in our own right, consumers of Matsumoto's law, are the ones who must calculate the multitudes of the master's mind. Because if you will forgive a little of Shakespeare here, since a crooked figure may attest in little place a million, and let us ciphers to this greater compt on your imaginary forces work. Tokinowa is the master's stage, on which his company of players, all in the same garb, turn about again and again, as we, who can see through the whole spread of the Leijiverse, in print or on screen, allow our own imaginations to be fired continually with the subtle and discreet interpretation of our master's mind. We'll deal with the rest later. See you in the discussions.
Hello, my name is Zack Davisson, and I'm a translator of many of Matsumoto Leiji's most classic manga, including Queen Emeraldess, Captain Harlock, and of course, Space Battleship Yamato. And I'm here to tell you today a little bit about my own personal experience with Matsumoto Leiji, as well as what it is like to translate the master himself. So let's go ahead and get started. I first encountered Matsumoto Leiji when I was very young. I think probably about 8 years old. For reasons I still don't understand today, someone decided it would be a great idea to pair Roger Corman's dub of Galaxy Express with Robin Williams and Shelley Duvall's fun musical comedy live action version of Popeye. My mom took us to go see it. It was me, my brother, a cousin, probably a couple of friends of us, and we all really were going to see Popeye. You know, Robin Williams was in it. He was really popular at the time as the lead of Mork and Mindy. And I'm very excited to go see Popeye. So we get there and we get into this screening, right? And Galaxy Express, really nobody knew anything about it. Looking at the poster, you knew nothing about it. Like the poster was as bland as you could possibly imagine. But we get in there and it gets dark and the movie starts. And I don't know how to describe it other than that. I was just transfixed. I had never seen anything like that before in my life. And I'm not just talking about the visual splendor, because that was, of course, amazing. You know, you have this train taking off into space. It looks cool. You visit all these different planets. There's all these robots. You know, there's all this stuff that's obviously cool, right? Visually cool, because Matsumoto Leiji is good at cool. But what really had this deep impact on me with Galaxy Express was the emotional depth of the story. And that wasn't something that you saw very much in children's entertainment at the time. You know, children's entertainment, Saturday morning cartoons, they were very sanitized. They were very neutered. There were stories of no consequences. I mean, they could be fun. You know, I loved Scooby-Doo. It was a lot of fun. You know, I loved things like the Smurfs. I mean, all of that was great, great fun. But it was stories of no consequences. What happened in one episode did not carry over to the other. Nothing happened. Nothing changed. Nothing mattered. They were just fun. But then I'm watching Galaxy Express, and for the first time, I'm really seeing this sort of medium of animation telling just a much deeper story, right? Their acts have consequences. You know, people die, people cry, which was also something amazing to me. Like seeing, and I think I was just the perfect age to just heavily imprint on Matsumoto Leiji's world, because you saw this boy roughly the same age as I was, you know, getting on this spaceship with this beautiful woman, and he's in tears and he's experiencing all these emotions, and it was really revelatory for me, because I of course had all these same emotions inside of me, but I didn't see anyone else with those emotions, right? I didn't see them on TV. If you saw children on television, they were cute, or they were plucky, or they were annoying, or they were anything but full realized characters. And it was a moment for me to realize that other people felt as I did, because Matsumoto Leiji was able to show that. Of course, as it was at the time, I never saw Galaxy Express again. You know, you leave not for many, many years. There was no rental, there was no streaming, so you lived the theater with this deep impression, and it fades into something almost like a dream. I didn't see it again until actually when I was in high school, when I saw it at a rental shop. But it was something that I never forgot, something that just haunted my memory constantly. I also, at the time, you know, after that, I discovered another Matsumoto Leiji work, which was Star Blazers. I didn't actually know that those two were connected, because other than visually, obviously they looked similar, but I just didn't know. I was 8. But you know, when I discovered Star Blazers, that was also just incredibly revelatory, you know, because you saw once again the same story that continued from episode to episode. People fell in love, people died, stories had consequences, and it was just amazing. I would wake up early every single morning to watch Star Blazers, and I would wake up early for nothing else. Many, many, many years later, decades later, when I became a professional translator, I really built my reputation on translating the works of another classic manga artist, Mizuki Shigeru, and his famous folklore comic Kitaro. But I never made a secret of my love of Matsumoto Leiji. And so one day, one of the editors at Kodansha, Ben Applegate, sort of like pulled me aside and gave me a secret message saying, "Zach, I've got a present for you." And when he told me what he had, I was just astounded. He had gotten the rights to Queen Emeraldess, and he had entrusted me with this great work to translate. And I couldn't have been more excited, but also intimidated, because here was this man whose work meant so much to me, and I just had to get it perfect. And it was a challenge. When I first started translating Matsumoto's work, it was so different from Mizuki Shigeru's, right? Mizuki Shigeru is very earthy. He's very human. He's very much about a person living in bodies with all of the struggles and pains and everything that it entails. Whereas Matsumoto Leiji's work was much more elevated. It was much more ethereal and numinous, about these people who had struggles and everything, but it was just so much on a different plane. And when I was working on the translation, I realized that I wasn't really satisfied with it because it sounded too much like Mizuki Shigeru. It sounded too earthy. And one of the things about Matsumoto's dialogue is that it could either sound really impressive and powerful and moving, or it can sound incredibly overwrought and cheesy and stupid. And as a translator, my job was to make sure that I was delivering this one and not this one. And the way that I sort of cracked the code of his work was I started listening to, because I knew that it was a big influence on him, so I started literally playing Wagner, Götterdämmerung in the background while I was translating, to try and get me into that headspace and get me into that mood, and to feel that sort of like weighty heaviness inside me when I was translating. And I started to approach his words not necessarily as dialogue, but as parts of music. And that was that, like I said, that really like made me, I guess, crack the code of Matsumoto Leiji translation more than anything else, because the way that his characters speak is very unnatural. It's not the way humans speak with each other. And generally, you're trying hard for natural dialogue, but you do not want natural dialogue in a Matsumoto book. Like, for example, Queen Emeraldis. Emeraldis, when she arrives, she will just announce herself all the time. I am Emeraldis. I am she who wanders the spaceways on eternity. Like she gives this sort of like declaration of self, and she does it all the time, every couple of pages. I am Emeraldis, blah 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 blah. And Captain Harlock does the same thing. It's like, I am Captain Harlock, sailing the sea of stars under a flag of bone. Like, they just always give these pronouncements, and I wasn't quite sure what to do with them until I thought about the music of Wagner, and I thought about his use of leitmotifs. Leitmotifs are basically pieces of music that announce a character has stepped on stage. So when you hear that call, you know exactly who's coming. Possibly the most famous one that everyone knows is Darth Vader's leitmotif in Star Wars. So dun 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 dun. And, as soon as you hear that, you know that Darth Vader is stepping on stage. That's a leitmotif. So I approached those bits of writing like that. So when Emeraldis is giving her announcement, I am Emeraldis, sorceress of the spaceways, whatever it is, that's what she's doing. She's doing her Wagnerian leitmotif of making her announcement before she steps on the stage. One of the things that I got to do with Matsumoto's work that was a lot of fun is I occasionally do translation battles with a good friend of mine, Jay Rubin, who's also a very respected translator. And what we'll do is I'll do one version of the translation, and he'll do another version of the same translation, and then we project them on stage next to each other during an event. And so for one of our translation battles, I decided to give him Queen Emeraldis to work on. So he translated Queen Emeraldis, and then I translated a different version of Queen Emeraldis. And I think our solutions to the translation are pretty interesting in and of itself. So I'm going to go ahead and read you Jay Rubin's version first, and then I will read you mine. So Jay had never heard of Matsumoto Leiji. He had no association whatsoever. So he kind of went into this blind, but he knew it was science fiction. So he pulled into his own childhood and remembered the announcement of Superman before the radio shows and the cartoons. And he sort of gave it in the same staccato rhythm where he went, Emeraldis, the one they call the she-devil of the universe, immortal woman who battles her way across infinite space, lone woman who wanders across the seas of outer space, and for what? Not a soul knows why. Woman of sorrow, of whom it is said, certain death awaits those unfortunate enough to cross the path of her ship, the Queen Emeraldis. Once, Hiroshi Umino encountered Emeraldis on the red sands of Argyle. And then my own version of it, I adapted this really sort of like poetic, rhythmic language that I did for translating Matsumoto language, or for translating Matsumoto Leiji, that I tried to give it like sort of the rocking of a sea ship, if you can think about that, with a lot of internal rhymes that help it sound more like music. Emeraldis, people call her the witch of the spaceways, an immortal who battles her way through the infinity of space. No one knows for what purpose this lonely wanderer drifts through the sea of stars. She is a woman of profound sorrow. Death is the only reward for those who encounter her or her ship, the Queen Emeraldis. Hiroshi Umino met Emeraldus above the red sands on Argyle, and on that day his long and melancholy tale began. So you can kind of see my approach there, and how I think I really justified and brought something of that magnificence of Matsumoto Leiji to the page, and hopefully I was successful with it, and hopefully people have enjoyed my work on the book, and I'm looking forward to talking to everyone else about this some more. So thank you very much, and once again, off we go.
This is the voice of Radio Free Arcadia. Thank you all for joining us today. Now that the presentations are done, I'm going to invite our guests and yourselves to join in a Q&A covering a number of topics that may touch on what we've already done, but hopefully we'll get into some of the deeper issues. Now, Tim, Deborah, Zach, are you ready to go?
Hashin.
Excellent.
Ready?
So then, I'm going to begin with question 1. Feel free to jump in at any point. Don't let the fact that I am a moderator moderate your responses. But the first question we received relates to Master Leiji's childhood, his youth in Kitakyushu and the city of Kurume during World War II, and how that might connect to his development as a creator, especially some of his earlier works. Otoko Oidon, for example, or his shoujo or his space opera. Now, I'd like to begin by talking about his wartime experiences, because that formed the backbone of 2 of my interviews with him for the recent book. And it came across that he was, as a younger child with several brothers and sisters, painfully attached to both his father and his mother, and how they dealt with, well, the horrors of watching a city burn several times during his career, a childhood, I should say. But most importantly was one particular day in which his father had come home from an operation called Tengo, the sinking of the battleship Yamato, in which he described to his son how, sitting 25,000 feet above the great ship, he felt it explode rather than watched it, and then looked down to see all his own air crew, the boys that he had trained. This is Matsumoto the Elder. And then getting home to have to tell the children and the parents of those flyers that they weren't coming home. That was the mission in which he hung up his hat and said no more tyranny, and never flew again, even after the war, refusing to join the Japan Self-Defense Forces, refusing to fly for civil airlines, because the thing he had loved became the thing that had destroyed him. Maybe that's why we see so much emphasis placed not on militarism, but anti-militarism in his works. Tim, I hope you can expand on that. But also, I was going to say, but also the nature of the characters as people who have walked away from something to prevent losing something else. Open it up. Let's see what people say.
Well, I've observed a few times, especially doing research for Space Battleship Yamato history articles, that most of the writers who created that show grew up in the same generation as Leiji Matsumoto after the war. And that story was not about victory. It was not about beating your enemy. It was about endurance. And that's something that only that generation could have learned in a country that lost a world war. And I think we're very lucky to have crossed over with enough of that generation to see that story expressed with those feelings and that philosophy. If Space Battleship Yamato were written by American writers, it would have been a completely different story with a completely different message. And so that's just one tiny sliver of what Leiji Matsumoto had to offer us, based on his background and the time that he grew up and the things that influenced him as a child.
Thank you.
Tim, I was going to ask a quick question there, or just maybe add, because I thought that was really interesting, being the country that lost the World War. And I think you see a lot of works from that time about understanding the war was lost while still trying to have respect for the people who fought the war, because they were just average people. They weren't faceless villains like you would see in an American production. They were people's fathers. They were people's brothers that actually fought the war. And in a way, almost like you may have seen that most recently in the Godzilla -1 film, an attempt to redeem the citizens that were forced to fight the war, rather than simply villainize them as the evil enemy that you would see in other films. Do you think there's a little something of that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a large part of what they all observed is that it was a blue collar war for them. The people doing the fighting were not the elite. They were all the regular people that you would normally have interacted with, just on a normal day, walking down the street, suddenly thrown into the defense of their country, not career military for the most part. And that's going to result in a very different set of stories that come out of an experience like that.
Thank you.
Oh, can I add something else also?
Absolutely.
This is unrelated to the World War II history, but in the question asking about his background in Kita-Kyushu, another issue also is that Kyushu is very far, both geographically and culturally, from Tokyo. Tokyo is not only the capital, it's also the media center. It's as if New York and DC and Los Angeles were all the same city. And so if you want to make it as a creator, especially back in the 1950s, you had to go to Tokyo. But the experience for people like Matsumoto coming from a place like Kyushu, a smaller town, it was very alienating to come from that kind of environment into Tokyo. And in particular, Kyushu has a very distinctive dialect, and people who come from other regions to Tokyo are expected to shed their dialect, or they face a lot of teasing and discrimination. And so, he struggled for about 10 years, working in shoujo manga and not really breaking out, and having this alienating experience from moving from a more rural, faraway area to the big city. And I think it's really interesting that his first breakout hit, Otoko Oidon, uses the Kyushu dialect in the title. That's like really distinctively saying where he's from and not trying to hide that. And I think part of what made that such a hit was the authenticity of like showing his real self and like not trying to like fit into that, or like shave off the edges of that identity.
That's wonderful.
I'm reminded of another story that I really like, which I've read a couple of different times in interviews. And this is related to his inspiration to move on to space opera. When he was on the train to Tokyo for the first time, leaving home on the adventure of a lifetime, he was roaring through the night across the Japanese countryside, and the sky above him was filled with stars. And whenever he was passing over water, the water would reflect those stars. And so he was surrounded by stars above and below on a train. And that's the idea that stayed with him until it could manifest itself as Galaxy Express.
Now that's a good point, Tim, and such a good point, in fact, that I'm going to hit you with question 2. Why were so many of his series set in space, do you think?
Because space is limitless, because space is unbound by normal rules, anytime you put down on a planet, you've got immediate physical rules that you have to follow. You're going to be bound by gravity. You're going to be in an atmosphere. You're going to be subject to weather. You're going to be around other people. You have to scrounge for food. You've got to do all the same things that you would do in your normal, everyday, humdrum, boring Earth life. But as soon as you step off a planet into infinite space with zero gravity, all of the possible adventures open up in front of you. And just speaking for myself as an author, I can't wait to get out into space when I'm writing a story, because all the rules change.
And
The
that's
limit-
interesting
oh, sorry.
because, and I love the limitedness about it, but it's also, he did something where he created a nostalgic science fiction, which I don't know if I'd seen anyone do that before, because because usually if you think future, you think full future, you're thinking, super spaceships and zappy guns and all that stuff, but he actually used ancient technology in space, and created this incredibly nostalgic sense to go along with that boundlessness, connecting almost as if a wheel of time.
And sea. He wasn't the first one he didn't coin the term Sea of Stars, but he made it his own.
Mm-hmm.
On an ocean of dreams. Right. Thank you very much. Now, for Deborah, I think this one has come in. How did Matsumoto approach talking about women in his seinen works? And what do you think influenced his development of his characters in the particular way that he did?
Oh, that wasn't the way I interpreted that question. I mean, the other participants here are the ones who have interviewed him and can talk more about how Matsumoto himself talked about his female characters. But speaking as an academic who writes about manga and anime, I mean, his depictions of women in manga are very sexist. And I don't think that we need to mince words about that or make excuses for it. I think the bigger question behind this is, what do we do with works that we love, especially from previous decades, that contain sexist content? And I mean, in my own research, I find that it is the most useful to be honest about that, and not to try to explain it away or say, oh, it was just of the time, it's what everyone else was doing, which is true, not everyone was writing like that, but it certainly was it was kind of the dominant mode, especially in seinen manga, which was, for people who don't know, seinen manga is aimed at older teenagers and young adult men. And the genre as a whole was an attempt to break away from the idea that manga was only for children, and to show that it could address more adult themes. And one of the ways that it did that was through graphic violence and a lot of nudity and sexist jokes and crude humor. And then still has continued in manga in many ways. But yeah, I mean, I think that we can hold this as a problem in his works, and not deny it. And it gets toned down a bit in the anime, but it's still there. And I remember very clearly having the experience as a child watching these on TV, and both enjoying and admiring the strong female characters, and also being troubled by the overt sexualization. I didn't have the terms to explain it at the time, but just sort of mentally editing out the scenes that bothered me. And yeah, I mean, this is a problem with particularly with older works from the 70s, but it still continues today. And with contemporary works, I think that we should have the freedom to push back against it. But with older works, I mean, we have to acknowledge that it's there.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with you entirely on what you said, especially as someone who translates a lot of older works. I mean, there's no reason to pretend that it's not something's not sexist or something's not racist, you know. And I think it's perfectly okay to look at, enjoy those works, and also at the same time, like you said, just say it exactly. You know, that is what it is. You know, yeah, I know. And I've had that argument with a couple of different translators before because there's some people who feel that you should sort of soften those blows when you're doing the translation. I don't agree. I think that it's, you know, it is what it is, you know, and just saying that out loud, acknowledging that there's no fault in doing that. Yeah.
Miyako Sensei pointed that fact out herself as Master Leiji's works advanced, that they themselves recognized that if they stifled what had gone before, removed it, edited it, simply did not publish it, it would do nothing to address matters. Now, you could argue that by the end of his career, he was more fully aware, but as was said, he had lived through 60 years of changing times.
Mm-hmm.
But Deborah's right. Simply brushing it under the carpet, either by editing or changing, would not do anything to change the facts of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Acknowledge it, deal with what it represents, move on.
Absolutely. And it does, I mean, some of that work, I mean, I don't think much of Matsumoto's work, but I mean, some things from the past are almost unpublishable nowadays, except for in an academic sense, because they are so sexist and racist. And, you know, there would be a justifiable backlash against them, you know. Fortunately, that's not the case with Matsumoto, but we can still, as Deborah said, acknowledge it.
Thank you. Now we're hitting on question 4. And this one I would like to throw back Tim's way to begin with. We touched on it a little in question 1, but I would like us to dig a little bit more into the idea of militarism within Matsumoto Sensei's works and whether or not he was promoting a particular political or social stance. What sort of values did he push or fight against? I'm curious how we all see this point of view. We could call it military fetishism, positive or negative. Tim, what do you think?
The question was posed in a very interesting way. The questioner asked how other fans and devotees reconcile his military fetishism with his anti-war stance. And I put a lot of thought into that. And what my conclusion is that they don't need to be reconciled because fetishism is actually the wrong term for what we see. Fetishism is a different category altogether because it evokes a certain level of eroticism, and it doesn't apply here because what we're seeing in all of the military-based manga stories is not fetishism, it's fascination. And you need to know something about the person who drew all that manga to understand why that fascination is there. And I can understand it as an artist myself. I'm fascinated with how human imagination meets the physical world. And that meeting point is something we call technology. We have ideas in our head and they manifest themselves through technology into physical objects. And an artistic mindset like Matsumoto's would find fascination with that at every level. It's the expression of the human mind working in concert with the physical world. And the way that manifested for him was as a child wandering around post-war Japan, surrounded by cast-off military equipment that was designed by a human mind for use by human hands. And it had form and it had function. And it was fascinating to sit there and stare at it and draw. And that found its way into his storytelling. Not at first, because as a younger artist, he had to go where the money was. And in the 1950s and 60s, the money was in girls' manga. And it wasn't until the 70s when he broke away from that and started drawing boys' manga that he had a chance to express this fascination for military technology. And the use of that helped him on a storytelling level to communicate the stories he'd heard from his father and from other veterans, and just from the ambient culture of post-war Japan, about what a tragedy it was and how sad that all of this amazing equipment was being used to kill other people. And so this is why I say we don't need to reconcile those things. We just need to observe how they fuse together, how his fascination as a child enabled him to express those stories in manga form and bring us into contact with the memories that were shared with him about the effect that they had on the human being. And so this is why we can extract an anti-war stance from his writing. Even if we don't understand all the words in Japanese, we can see the way that these things are rendered, especially the human beings. They're so sympathetic. It's very easy to look at them and have instant empathy and to understand what they're facing as representations of people. Now with Space Battleship Yamato, we have sort of an inflection point, because that's where he first worked in anime. It's where he began to collaborate with other writers in anime. They all took a shot at that story. They all heavily rewrote it from one draft to the next. His was one of many drafts. Prior to his involvement, the story drafts were sort of militaristic in that they put together a spaceship that was based on a naval vessel with officers and enlisted men and rank systems and everything else. And he was the first one to demilitarize the story and set up what we later learned, saw to be a science fiction tale instead of a military tale. It's barely even a military tale in space until we get to the point where we're fighting other military. But I think his greatest contribution to Space Battleship Yamato was taking the militarism out of it and making it a story that would translate much more fluidly to other cultures. Back to you.
Thank you. To the
we
floor,
all-
if anyone.
Yeah, to the floor. I think that's great, Tim. But I also think a little bit like Deborah said about the sexism. I think sometimes it's okay to call it straight out that, yeah, there's some military fetishism in there, I feel like, and that's part of the appeal. Like, I gotta admit, Space Battleship Yamato, I've got a model of it sitting on my desk. It looks cool, man. I love all the guns on it. I love all the planes. Like, I love all of the weapons and everything, and that's also a huge part of the appeal. I mean, I don't want to fight anyone, but I also can't deny that sometimes giant, massive weapons of war and huge guns aren't just the coolest thing I've ever seen, you know?
Yeah, and if I can add also, I mean, yeah, this is my interpretation also, like you have to acknowledge that it's there, even though the anti-war themes are also there and quite prominent. And I think part of the reason why this shows up again is because of his childhood. This intense militarism was like the air that he breathed, and it's very difficult to get that, or to completely wipe that from your mind as you're creating as an adult. And we see this not only with Matsumoto, but with other directors of the same generation, especially Tomino Yoshiyuki with Gundam, and even with Miyazaki Hayao, for all of their anti-war stance, which is very prominent in their stories, there is still this fascination, particularly with the machinery and with the regimentation and with the big emotions that the battle scenes stir up. And I think part of this is the generation that they were part of, and part of it also is anime movies as a spectacular medium. You have to make these scenes exciting. You have to make it melodramatic and spectacular for people to want to watch it. And that's always sort of working against the anti-war theme, but it's just an inherent tension in our entertainment. And we can't get rid of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like the fault of any individual director.
And I know one thing, like from that time, especially, and I think part of this was occupied America creating these rules, but they were not allowed to make any sort of military stuff where the soldiers were heroes. Like it all had to be kind of a bummer. And I think that bleeds into what with Matsumoto's work as well. Because they were surrounded and raised in militarism, but they were never allowed to celebrate it in any way except for that way. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much. In fact, that's such a good answer, Zach. I'm going to hit you up with the next question. Ethics. Not necessarily just military ethics, but what sort of ethical and moral position do you see when translating Matsumoto Sensei's work? For example, what about between humans and non-humans, attitudes towards violence, injustice, inequality, or even towards a planet?
Yeah, and I think it's such a deep and complex question. And I think especially there's a real danger trying to impose, especially like Western political ideology on something from that person and from that era. Like I would never want to discuss Matsumoto's work of right wing or left wing. I think those are irrelevant terms. We're only seeing it through our lens, and basically a bit of cultural imperialism there. I feel like his work touches on a very almost mythological basis rather than a political basis. This ideals of freedom, these ideals of justice, these ideals of romance and adventure. There was always this term where they have it in the theme song, for Star Blazers, Otoko no Roman, the romance of men. And I think about that a lot in Matsumoto because like I said in my video, especially at the time, there wasn't a lot of that. There wasn't a lot of the ability for men to dream, for boys to dream. Like we were limited in our capacity to feel. And in Matsumoto's work, it's all about feelings. It's all about the feelings of men. And I often will, when people talk about concept of toxic masculinity, well, what's non-toxic masculinity? And I use Matsumoto as an example. He is an example of absolute masculinity. Like there is no way, and I was doing that when I was translating. It's like how do you keep gender, you put gender all in there. His work's all about gender. It's all about being a man and a boy does not cry and all of this stuff. And that is hard coded into it. And I think that's okay, because I think it is a very positive statement on this sort of masculine idea of dreams and everything, and this ability to have romance, and this, and as far as fighting and everything else and the ethics of that, I once again, I just don't see it through that much of a political vein because it's so much more operatic and it's so much more mythological than that. Jump in, everyone. Yeah.
That was a highly articulate and emotional outburst, Zach.
You get a lot from me. That's what I'm there for.
I'll fill the silence. Oh, sorry, Deborah.
Oh, sorry, I thought that Tim was going to speak. I didn't want to jump in. I really like this quote from Zach about Otoko no Roman. And this word roman comes from romanticism, but it doesn't mean romantic or sexual love. It means more like melodrama or, all these things that Zach was just talking about. Mythologizing. And that's definitely what he's doing. And I think maybe also a way to kind of process the experience of, defeat in World War II and then the occupation, that's the, as Zach said, that's the cultural backdrop that we have to see all of this against. And then the question had also mentioned environmental themes, which is also a big part, particularly of Yamato. And the 1970s was the moment where environmentalism really got started in Japan. It suddenly came to the forefront in people's consciousness, particularly with the mercury poisoning incident in Minamata, and other examples of environmental degradation that were happening in Japan and around the world. And so we start to see these kinds of pro-environmental themes in anime and other forms of pop culture become really important. And all, this is a natural parallel with the anti-war themes also.
And a further thing that sticks in my mind is we often don't, with any creator, get a view into their own particular processes. And it wasn't until preparing for the book that I was able to ask him what were the key pillars of his own interpretive development. And it came down to the two things he thought of as foundational, which shocked me. First was his fascination with Goethe, Johann Goethe, and his particular philosophy of Bildungsroman, development and growth and personal responsibility. And I can see that in a lot of his characters, Tetsuro, Tochiro. Harlock's more of a paragon, doesn't really change a great deal, but he doesn't need to.
Well, he's like I don't know what the literary term is, but he is the thing that causes the change. Emeraldus is they're like avatars rather than personalities,
Yeah. And on top of that, the one thing that stood out in my mind was this little tiny book, horribly thumbed, called Captain Blood by Raphael Sabatini. Now, I'd read it as a kid, and I liked it because, I'd liked the film, Errol Flynn and all that. But the notion of an individual taken against their will into a system and to use the weapons or the horror of that system against, he tried to convey to me the idea that we often become obsessed with the tools of evil. After all, we all love pirates, don't we? Why? Butchers and brutes, all of them, potentially. But I hear talk from him about the egalitarianism aboard the floating world. Mm-hmm. It's the thing that reflects to me in some of the darker parts of his narratives. The brutalism that even Harlock and Myrtle, destroying an entire planet for the common good, including parents. Well, no, Dad's already dead, but that's a different story. Oh, thank you very much. Mm-hmm. Let's run on now. I hate to come back to you, Tim.
Do you?
But since you're dressed as the way you are, repping both Yamato and Harlock, can we have a quick reveal of the Harlock, please? There we go. So I'm gonna hit you again with Yamato.
Go right ahead.
There's there's a great deal of hoo-ha surrounding Matsumoto's involvement with the series. Mm-hmm. Where does the truth lie? What are the main myths?
Well, the first truth is that he had a huge impact on the story, which I've already explained. As the first animated production he was ever involved with, he stepped forward to contribute to it at just about every possible level once it went into production, and vowed after it was over that he would never do it again. And we all know where that went. But I think the questions that we got about his involvement with Yamato have more to do with where it is today than where it was yesterday. It's well known that there was an ownership lawsuit brought by Matsumoto against the producer, Nishizaki, back in the 90s, which Matsumoto lost. And I'm torn about that result. As a fellow creator, I wish he had gotten more out of that. But as someone who's been involved in many different productions. I understand the ruling and I agree with it in the end. Unfortunately, what that led to was the fact that he could not be involved in the Yamato remakes. I would like to have seen what his involvement could have created. On the other hand, I have no regrets at all about what we have in his absence, and I'm very happy to see it continue. I was happy to see him continue with his own works, separate and distinct from Yamato, which I think have equal value of their own, and we're lucky to have all of them. But I think there's a general misconception that where Yamato goes, the rest of the Matsumoto universe will follow. And that is incorrect because of very distinct categories of ownership, chiefly being that Yamato is run by Tohoku Shinsha, and most of Matsumoto's anime works are run under the umbrella of Toei. Two different companies, very different international relationships. And so even though we see some global success on the part of Yamato, it does not then automatically follow that Harlock and Galaxy Express will occupy the same channels. So I just thought that it was worth answering that question and laying it to rest.
Thank you very much. I certainly don't have anything to add to that, but I will open it to the floor.
Yeah, that's Tim's area of expertise. Like, yep.
If you want to find out more, go to ourStarblazers.com. I've been writing that website for over 20 years, and there's no end in sight.
Although I gotta say, one thing that's interesting is I still think of Yamato as Matsumoto's work, even like the stuff that comes up, and you see that a lot. Like when I have my translations of Star Blazers 2199 on my same shelf with my other Matsumoto's work, even though I know it is not in fact Matsumoto's work. It's like his spirit is still in the ship somehow, even though it's not his hand directing it.
Of course.
Does Leiji still have ownership over some of the visual rights, though, Tim? Every time I go to an exhibition, they're always selling Yamato pictures. And
that's right. The result of the lawsuit was that Matsumoto was awarded certain visual rights, meaning that if there was some object in the original Yamato anime series that he created from start to finish by himself, he could continue to market that object in whatever form he wanted, as long as he didn't apply the name Space Battleship Yamato to it. So, for example, he was awarded visual rights for two of the very first spaceships we saw on the Earth side, the Earth Battleship and the Yukikaze. And so he could market those under different names, which he did. And this explains why there are certain visual elements that we don't see in the remakes, such as the original Cosmo gun. That was a Matsumoto design from start to finish. And so there is still a Cosmo gun that occupies the same space in the story, but it is not identical to his. And so if anybody wanted to market an original Cosmo gun, they would have to go through Matsumoto's company to do it.
I think someone made a water pistol version.
Yes, indeed.
Zach, you probably got one. No,
yes,
Tim, you definitely have one.
I've been told not to show it here because apparently
please,
no
please,
guns allowed. Yeah.
YouTube is getting notorious about clamping down on that sort of thing.
I asked if I could bring a sword out, but we weren't sure. So, no weapons on the YouTube channel.
Thank you very much, Tim.
Yeah. Tim, and that's an interesting thing too, because, as maybe everyone doesn't know, but Captain Harlock actually debuted in the Space Battleship Yamato manga, and he still obviously kept control of that, even though he never did appear in the show.
Captain Harlock appeared in every form of the original story except for the anime.
Yeah, except for the anime.
He was in each of the manga versions. There were 3 of them drawn by different artists. And he appeared in the original novelization as well. But before they got to the point where he would enter the anime story, the series order was cut down from 50 episodes, or no, sorry, from 39 episodes to 26. His part of the story was excised. I'm sure Matsumoto breathed a huge sigh of relief in retrospect because that put the character completely back under his umbrella.
Under his control. Yeah, yeah.
Right then, we're getting on for time, but I think we've got time for one more question. And this one is for everybody. Picking it up from Tim's and Deborah's presentations particularly, there's a lot of work out there that has not been touched by the Western market for various reasons, primarily one. However, what are your favorite lesser works and why?
Who goes first?
Yeah,
you jumped in
anyway,
first,
we want to
Tim.
jump in. Go ahead, Tim.
I loved Galaxy Railways. I consider it a lesser known work because it's not Yamato, Harlock, or Galaxy Express, although it's a spin-off of Galaxy Express. But one of the greatest experiences I had watching anime in my early years was seeing Yamato 2 for the first time. That story just grabbed me and wouldn't let go. And the first time I saw Galaxy Railways, I felt exactly the same thing. That story was so well built and had such a great climax. I just couldn't turn it off. So that's my vote.
Nice.
But why? Oh.
Why?
Galaxy Railways doesn't need to be just thrown away like that. Let's give it its proper due.
Oh, I was going to talk a bit more about that also, if that's okay.
Oh, absolutely.
Do it.
So, Galaxy Express 999, or in Japan is called Suri 9. It was a TV series, and then it was remade as a movie, which is a very common thing to do, back before streaming and before VHS tapes. When things were broadcast serially, if you missed the installments, that was it. You didn't get to see it. And so a lot of animation studios would grow their audience by condensing a long series into a film and then releasing it into the theater. And this still happens, but like in the 70s and 80s, it was really important for growing the audience. And so that's what happened with Galaxy Express. And actually, the director of that film is Rintaro. It wasn't Matsumoto, but it's still based on his story. And there is an English translation of that film. I've used it in my class many times. I do recommend watching it if you can find it. It is a great film, and it's also strangely really important in Japanese art history. Because Murakami Takashi, the fine artist who created the Superflat exhibition in the year 2000, the whole premise of Superflat was to look at classical Japanese art and anime and at the same level. And for the first time, he took stills from animation and put it in a museum and put it up alongside famous hokusai prints and also 17th and 16th century paintings. And this was really important for the high culture cachet of anime. And what he was particularly interested in that exhibition was the explosion scenes at the end of Galaxy Express and the dramatic diagonals that the in-between artists created in those scenes, and how they created almost abstract flashing light patterns through limited animation. And he sees parallels in classical Japanese art that also used a lot of diagonal lines and asymmetrical compositions. And so this is kind of the basis of his idea of Superflat, which has now become not only a major force in the fine art world, but also in academic writing on animation is also, heavily reliant on this concept of Superflat. And this all comes from Galaxy Express, and particularly those explosion scenes. And so this is kind of a detour, this is a way that it has become part of the culture and the academic scene apart from the narrative, in terms of the art. But also in terms of the narrative, it's also a great film. I do recommend people watch it. And then my other favorite, lesser known, is Queen Millennia. And actually not the original. It was cut up and joined with Captain Harlock and broadcast on TV in the United States. And I watched that as a child, and it was really influential on me, because there were female lead characters. I mean, I just talked a lot about sexism in his work, which I still think is a problem, but it was one of very, very few stories that had female characters as the leads who were really like driving the plot. And so for that reason, it still holds a special place in my heart, and I really wish, because the story for the American version was completely changed, I wish that there would be also a translation of Queen Millennia, the original story, and we could see that also, which also has a lot of environmental themes in it, in the original.
Could certainly do with Millennia,
Good.
absolutely. With the Guitar soundtrack as well.
Yes. Good answers, and I hope that you like if you're watching the discotheque version of those films. I wrote the Matsumoto Bible, language Bible for those, so I hope they're good translations. So my personal pick, I think every translator has a wish list of stuff that they would love to put out, but they know is entirely unmarketable in the Western audiences. And like Otoko Oiran would definitely top that list if I could, because I think it's just such an important work. But I also like Matsumoto's Cockpit series as well. That's something that I think is quite beautiful. And there's one of my favorite ones that is, I cannot in any way justify this as being one of his greater works, but I'm just extremely fond of Sexoroid. I think Sexoroid is a great 60s, awful, terrible, super fun, sex robots and, all that sort of stuff. Like, it's one of my favorite ones of his that will probably also never be translated because it's Sexoroid, but I think it's great.
I know I go on like a broken record about this. I did it in the book. I did it in my presentation here. But I figure if I keep repeating this story, someone with a bit of cash will hire Zach to translate Maria of the Silver Valley. Now,
oh yeah,
I didn't pick up on this at the time, 1958, obviously. It came out of just a sentence, a throwaway sentence by Miyako Sensei about iconoclasm. The idea that whilst Leiji Sensei was working on shoujo comics and not, as Deborah quite rightly said, breaking through because of either he wasn't not the right fit for the environment, or what would you say, Deborah?
I'm sorry, what?
Oh, what was the primary reason that Matsumoto Sensei really just didn't make it as a shoujo writer?
Shoujo manga was changing to reflect more the tastes of girls, and I think that he felt that he wasn't, like as a man, that he wasn't in tune with what girls wanted to see. And this is something that his wife was really good at, I think that he could see like she was really tapping into the stories and the aesthetics that girls wanted. And shoujo manga went through a big shift through the 1950s, 1960s from stories for little kids that were like, melodramas and girls with, missing parents and that kind of thing, towards Bildungsroman, so stories of adolescent development that reflected the, like the adolescent interiority of teenage girls. So yeah, I think that he felt he was not really tapped into that. And I think his main interest was always in science fiction. And, there's always been science fiction and particularly horror for girls, but it wasn't a major genre for girls at the time.
Thank you. Now that cuts back very nicely to what where Maria went. He was handed a commission for yet another fairly straightforward historical romance. And Miyako Sensei said, why don't you do something radical with it? And so he threw in Mu, as the Auguste Leplomb's idea of the lost kingdoms. He threw in the war against the gods. because, as she said to him, you can have romance and action, and girls will eat it up. But to me, it had the opposite effect. It reminded him of his loves, of adventure, of space, of the wheel of time. That book and Otoko Oidon, those are the two that I want translated, because they both, one peripherally and one directly, fit into the creation of Tokinowa. And Otoko Oidon not only makes way for Harlock and Emeraldus, but Tim, you said something a little earlier on while we were prepping this about Otoko Oidon. Something about it being a more
semi-autobiographical. The fact that it was written, it was informed by Matsumoto's early experiences as a struggling manga artist trying to make it in the big city, and often unable to afford a decent meal and just barely making rent month after month. And I think the fact that it was informed by his own life experience to a much greater degree than anything he had created before that. But that's what made it his most personal and favorite creation, and made him want to continue and to take that that vibe into all of his future work. And I think that's what makes all of his space opera stories so identifiable, is he never lost touch with who he used to be. And there is always some character who represents that.
The uncommon folk, the ordinary folk. I suppose that's why he's so fond of that image of someone him trying to cook the egg over the light bulb. That says a lot to all of us.
Oh, yeah. Well, I just got a visitor, and I feel like we can't have a proper Matsumoto panel without a cat in it. So not quite May, but there's a cat for you.
Mikuna's got to get everywhere.
Miku, yeah. You know, and one of those things that I just thought I'd address, because it's a question that gets asked all the time, is like, why are there not more Matsumoto works in translation? Why are these works not translation? And the real and unhappy, inconvenient truth about that is just like, when everyone asks why, the answer is almost always because money. And it's the answer nobody likes to hear, but it's the reality of the world. It costs money to license those works, to translate them, to publish them. You know, and the sales just aren't there on older classic manga. I mean, I hope that, you know, times change, and you're seeing a lot of stuff translated now that was completely unmarketable 5-10 years ago, you know, and I hope that when people see stuff like this, you know, they develop an interest and maybe dip their toe to the pool into some of the older stuff, because if they can show demand, if they can show interest by purchasing the stuff that already exists, you know, that's what sends a message to publishers that there is a greater market for this. And so, yeah, I mean, I hope that the time will come when there is a market for Otoko Oidan, but it is not today, and maybe it's tomorrow, and I certainly hope so, because it deserves to be translated. But that's why, you know, plain and simple, it's just the sales market on classic manga is not there. So and it needs to grow up to a point where people are willing to pay money to read those.
Even here, I'm afraid, even here, a company called Mandarake tried to market a really high quality version of an early story called Natasha. And it tanked like a lead balloon until, of course, 10 years later, and everyone suddenly wants it, but it's not there anymore.
Yeah.
Maybe in the future.
There's always hope. Like, I've seen stuff get published, like as I just said, you know, like Asta no Joe, it just recently got announced by Viz, and that was a work that is one of the great classics of Japanese manga. And it's been amazing that it has not ever been translated, and it was considered to be unmarketable, but now it is, and so that's great. And maybe, you know, hope springs eternal. You know, I still couldn't believe when I was hired, you know, originally by Kodansha and by Seven Seas, you know, to translate these works, because they were so important and they had never been translated. And that is astounding to me. That something like Space Battleship Yamato, with its vast audience and its huge worldwide impact, had never been in English before. And hopefully all of its time will come. I have faith.
All things in the wheel of time.
Exactly.
This is Radio Free Arcadia, thanking all our participants today. we now hand back to the Japan Foundation. Sakiya-san, are you there?
Hi everyone, I'm back. Thank you so much for your great comments. I actually learned a lot from your comments too in the live chat. So there is some questions from the and comments from the audiences. I thought it's worth to mention here, and also some questions from registrants that we couldn't get into in a discussion session that I would like to ask. So first question is, there were some comments in the live chat about censorship of Yamato in United States. Do you have anything to say about censorship?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think like all of us could probably have a lot to say about it. I will say that when Star Blazers was put on the air, it was an entirely different time, and localization practices were different. Just like they were, like one of my favorite things to do is look at the history of localization and how things change. And some things are highly appropriate to certain eras. Like if you look at translations from the 1800s, they translated things differently than they did now. Like samurai was translated as knight. You would think that Japan was a place filled with knights and fairies and everything like that, because that's how they localized things. And then in the 70s, they localized it a different way, and we do things differently now. And I'm always a little frustrated. I don't know. I don't love the word censorship because I think it's more editorial rather than censorship. They did what they needed to do to get it on the air, and that was the correct choice at the time, because look at us. It obviously was the correct choice because here we are, because here's Tim in his jacket and all this other stuff that would never have happened had they not made those choices. Were we to do it now in the current era, I think we would make different choices, but I think that was the right thing to do at the time, whether I like it or not. It was correct.
Yep, all things constantly evolve. And we cannot lose sight of the fact that, number one, Star Blazers was packaged for kids around 10 years old, maybe younger. And at the time it aired, we were only about 25 years outside of World War II, which meant we had a lot of living veterans who may not have been kindly disposed toward a show that featured a real Japanese battleship.
Mm-hmm. And as a kid at the time, I wouldn't have had the slightest idea what the Yamato was. But the Argo, I knew that from Greek mythology. Jason the Argonauts, absolutely. Hooked me right away.
Mm-hmm.
Whoever made that choice made a remarkably good one, because it's something that we all could recognize in our own cultural context.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I believe so. I mean, I think like all of those, Captain Avatar, like Wildstar, it's hard for me I can't forget those names, even though I know their current names, I cannot erase Nova and Wildstar from my head, because that is how I first encountered them and fell in love with them. And it's like asking a French person to not say Abator when they're talking about Harlock. It's just like, I'm sorry, I love the Argo, I love Captain Avatar, I love Nova, I love all of them.
So next question is something actually we got from the registrants, and one of the questions that I also very interested to know is the influence of Matsumoto to the following artists. So who are some well-known mangaka who have stated that they are inspired by Matsumoto sensei's works?
Well, that sounds like one for Zach.
I like this question. I mean, I feel like almost every manga artist currently working, especially anyone who works in science fiction, is influenced in some way by Matsumoto. But I also find his international influence to be extraordinary as well. Like Rebecca Sugar, who does the TV show Steven Universe, for example, is highly influenced by Leiji Matsumoto, and in fact put in a Leiji Matsumoto named Blue Diamond inside of her series as a homage to him directly. Kazu Kibushi, who does the series Amulet, is also highly influenced by by Matsumoto. When I first picked up Amulet and I saw like almost the first page, there's this little short guy walking in a giant hat and a cloak, and I'm like, oh my god, he has manifested Matsumoto on the page here in this comic book that is enormously popular with my niece and nephew. Like they absolutely love Amulet, you know, and his influence is vast. You know, obviously, I think most people are aware of his influence on Star Wars. You know, I think if you're not, you should be. Much of Star Wars aesthetics was drawn from Leiji Matsumoto. You know, I just think we would live in a very different looking world if he had never existed because his influence is so vast.
Any other comments on that?
I don't know many, but the two that stick out in my mind are the classic one, Oda. Is it Oda? No, Eiichiro Oda, One Piece. That not just for the pirate element, but his comments about developing a sense of visual style that came from Matsumoto's, well, he called it Matsumoto's eyes. I'm not saying that before the development of the Leijiverse, characters did not have that big-eyed style. That was something that was brought over via Disney or possibly the Fleischer brothers.
No, it comes from girls' culture in the 1930s.
Yeah, I'm gonna say that's one of those popular myths that does not hold up to actual factual research. So yeah.
I've been put
I saw Deborah's face there.
Sorry,
like, I know what she's gonna say. I know.
Can't let that Disney myth perpetuate.
No,
yeah.
Set it then.
Oh, yeah, so girls' magazines in the 1930s and serialized fiction that was heavily illustrated, and the illustrators who worked on it gradually increased the size of the eyes. And the artist Nakahara Junichi was the one who really created the gigantic eyes with lots of highlights. If you look at his work from the 1930s and 40s, you'll see like this is shoujo manga, like this is where it comes from. And then after the war, later artists like Takahashi Makoto in the 1950s brought that style into shoujo manga. And Maki Miyako also was influenced by that earlier culture. So yeah, I mean, in talking about the shoujo influence on Matsumoto's work, like the large eyes with lots of highlights, you know, the way he puts that in there more so than a lot of other shonen or seinen artists, I think definitely comes from shoujo manga.
Tim?
I have nothing to add to this one, unfortunately.
Yeah. Oh, but back to the original question. I mean, in terms of his influence on later creators, it's not just the art style, but also the plot points from Yamato that get repeated, you know, over and over again in anime. And so much so, I think that maybe now more difficult for younger viewers to go back and watch it if they've never seen it. You know, it starts to seem derivative, even though it is the thing that everything derives from, you know. It's the same problem I think that Dune has, you know, like people watching the Dune movies for the first time and then they think, wait, this is like everything else. No, everything else is like this.
Yep.
So for the next question, it's like so what is his main source for making works, or what works have had particularly significant influence on his works? Any idea?
What works influence his works?
Yeah.
I mean, I believe Night on the Galactic Railroad is a big influence for sure. I don't know. I'd kick that one over to you guys, except for Night on the Galactic Railroad. That's all I really know.
I mean, when he and the gang lived in that, was it Kichijoji commune they all had? Yokoyama and the guys together. They all shared a lot of work. There's that famous story of Tezuka coming over one night with rolls of film to use Matsumoto's projector to check his dailies on Tetsuon Atom. So I think Miyako Sensei was right when she talked about that time as a sort of cultural boiler, and everyone borrowed from everybody else.
Mm.
Tezuka had great respect for them both. So did Yokoyama Mitsuteru. So did Monkey Punch, who dropped him from time to time, and so did Shiba Tetsuya, who seemed to be like an eternal hanger-on. If you've got the permission of people to pirate your work or your ideas, is it really pirating? Sharing?
Hmm.
A communal influence, especially at the opening of the modern industry, 1949 to 1960, when things were beginning to pick up. That's just a hypothesis based on a couple of conversations, but I'd love to have seen it close up.
Speaking of influences, I don't know, has anyone yet mentioned Mariano of My Youth? Because obviously that was a massive influence on him. I don't remember. It seems like it shouldn't be unsaid, but I don't know if anyone has said it yet.
Oh, I haven't. No. I mean, it's difficult to say because the story about it changes from time to time. It was different in the first interview. It was different in the last interview. But there was always this notion that he absolutely adored Marianne Holt. And a lot of her DNA, if you will, ended up in Mehta and other characters. I mean, he was so much driven by the film that I think it was in 91, he accepted an invitation to a comic convention in France at Angoulême. Mostly on the understanding that afterwards he will be able to hire a car and drive around France and Germany to the filming sites, which he did.
That's awesome. I love that.
Okay.
There's another story that I've read bits of here and there about a children's book that really caught his imagination as a boy. And I can't remember the exact title, but I think it was The Adventure of a Honeybee. And it eventually became an anime series that was imported, or rather exported to the rest of the world under the name Maya the Bee. And I believe Matsumoto's first manga that he did as a teenager, called Adventure of a Honeybee, was based on that, or at least strongly influenced by it, to the point where he wanted to one day create the definitive anime version of that story, and began to develop the film in his head, so to speak. The only way he could actually manifest it was on paper. But for years and years, he just kept coming back to it as something he would one day like to do. And it led to what I think is a very interesting moment in his pre-anime career, where he learned that a studio was beginning to make that series that became known later as Maya the Bee. And he went to that studio to see if there was any chance of employment, or maybe was invited. I can't remember which. Probably invited because he had a manga career at the time and was well known. But they had already begun to develop a story that was different from his vision. And so he lost the ability to bring that dream to life. And that is what freed him up to accept work on Space Battleship Yamato.
Always comes back to Yamato. And then, of course, the films, the things that he himself consumed ravenously. Scarlett O'Hara absolutely fell in love with that character. He's obsessed with the moment in which she's dragging a carrot out of the ground and proclaiming that she'll never be hungry again. And then his adoration for, was it Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger, for the film Matter of Life and Death, or Stairway to Heaven in the States. Two people stuck between heaven and hell, a sort of reverse Wizard of Oz, black and white and color. He seemed to be a person who consumed media himself absolutely ravenously and left himself open to ideas from everyone around him. That is something I think we often forget. He's not just an individual in isolation, but a person wrapped, as it were, in a sense of dream, if that means anything.
Oh, it means everything. Like wrapped in a sense of dream could be like the That could be the title of a biography of Matsumoto Leiji right there. I think you've nailed
God,
it,
I missed
Darren.
that one.
Yeah. I don't know why, and this is apropos of nothing, but I think it's just a fun little thing to throw in there because you said Scarlett O'Hara, and then we were talking about happy accidents. I love the weird little Matsumoto bit of trivia that he thought that the red stones were the emeralds, and that's why Queen Emeraldis is named Queen Emeraldis, because he thought that rubies were emeralds because he got the English wrong. And that's just still, I love the fact that, because otherwise she would have been Queen Ruby, which is not nearly as cool a name as Queen Emeraldis.
Makes her sound like a wrestler.
Right? Yeah. Like, I'm so glad he made that mistake. It just made things so much better.
You see what you get in here? This is the sort of Matsumoto trivia that no one else has. Next
although,
one, Sakia.
Yeah, although the time is coming, but one or hopefully two more questions. So this is a question from live audience. Did Matsumoto popularize pretty woman characters? People online have a fascination for 80s authentic, like the woman of macros, and it feels to me in a way it started with him. Any thoughts?
I mean, it was certainly for me, it was the first time I saw them on TV. I mean, like like that was one of the reasons why it was so amazing when I first saw Galaxy Express, because Maytal was so absolutely stunning and shocking and beautiful in a way that and ethereally beautiful, in a way that I'd never seen anything like that before. So I don't know if he started it, but he certainly had an impact on me.
Deborah?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the question at all.
Would you say that like the idea of like that sort of like beautiful woman in anime manga, did he start that, or was that something that existed before him?
I mean, it's really hard to say. He certainly wasn't the only one doing it, and I think that like if he had never existed, that it would have, there would have been other creators. Also putting in beautiful, sexy women into sci-fi stories, but yeah, I mean, there is something distinctive about not only the female character designs, but also the fact that he has female protagonists and antagonists. Yeah, like he has created these very complex characters, and certainly, like you said, also I had the same experience as a child watching this on TV in the US, and it was so unlike anything else that was on TV in the US, like really different than what was being created in the US for children.
I'd certainly never seen that sort of one elfin style of character prior to. Oh, I think the first time I saw them was the Nintendo Galaxy Express film.
Especially with the hair. I mean, you got to think about the hair. Like that's such a big part of his aesthetic, right? Not just the face and everything, but just the masses of beautiful, beautiful hair. Yeah,
and it strikes me how different his beautiful women are from the current like Bishoujo, or like the style of girl that's really popular with otaku now. Like fashions change, so of course the style of character design will change over time, but it feels like he was doing something quite different than what we see in contemporary anime.
And we have to remember the generational cycle as well. A lot of the designers and artists who were creating anime in the 80s were influenced by what they saw growing up in the 70s. And there he was.
Okay, thank you so much. One last question is, what was the rationale behind writing his surname with an L in English? That's true. Like usually, like an R might be used.
Yeah, I mean, he did this to make it sound more foreign, to make it look more foreign. And he's not the only one who has done this. A lot of other writers and artists do that. Takashi Makoto started spelling his name Makoto with a C in the 1950s. The manga artist Ano Moyoko does this,
Mm.
and the novelist Takemoto Nobara. Instead of Nobara, he spells it with a V and an L. It's to make it seem more foreign, exotic, and
Yeah,
pleasing.
in Leiji's case, I believe more French also because like the L just
Mm.
looks a little bit more French, and he loved France, as we know, and that exoticism of Europe and everything like that. So yeah,
Mm.
it's some people may not know that too, so it's worth pointing out. Many time manga artists get to choose their own how their name is written in English. I mean, there's when you're dealing with manga artists, obviously you get to pick how you're named. And he liked the romance of Leiji, the foreignness of Leiji rather than Reiji.
Yeah, and even as early as the
Mm.
1950s, some of them would sign their names on their works in Romaji, in English, or Roman letters. And fine artists did this too. It was a way of connecting with Western culture.
Mhm. And that's another thing, like when you're doing translations too, is like oftentimes they'll write stuff in English and sometimes you're just stuck with that, you get it, like they put it in there, it's like, well, that's what they wrote. Except for with Matsumoto's case, I was not going to be stuck with Herlock. I don't care if he wrote it as Herlock. He doesn't get to be Herlock. He is Harlock. And so when I was doing my translation on Captain Her, the ship flies by and written on the big sign is Herlock. I'm like, nope, sorry, Leiji. You don't get that one. It's Harlock.
Yeah, I mean, this is the problem because it feels one way in a Japanese language
Mhm.
context. And then when it gets brought over to the United States, it feels very different to people who are native English speakers.
Mhm. Totally.
There's another dimension to that as well that I think is worth mentioning before we break, and that is that the original form of Leiji is, of course, Reiji, which can translate to zero, which invokes the numerology that we see in a lot of his storytelling. 999, for example, being right on the edge of 1,000. The number 9 comes up over and over and over as a symbol of, a young man, for example, on the edge of adulthood, or something just on the edge of infinity. And I think choosing the name Reiji over Akira for its translatability to the number 0 is another example of that.
They've done it. It was intentionally turned that way when the company was chartered. It's not Reijisha, it's Reijisha, as in they and then G for time. If you check the company name, it's not Warrior Zero, it's Zero Time.
Mhm.
I'm not quite sure whether that's. I like to think of it as an intentional play on that, emphasizing eternity, but it only appears in the name of the company.
Yeah.
I wonder if it's because he did.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Zach. Sorry.
I was gonna say he certainly loved to use the name Zero too. Oh my gosh, he named quite a few different characters Zero, so he clearly did like that. Hmm.
There's a certain thing though. Zero to him seems to mean eternity.
Hmm.
A ring here. Is it a Western thing to think of zero as worthless, nothing, absent?
Well, and if you think of the Zen circle, there's a lot of like more, I think, aestheticism around the concept of a circle in Japan that, when you do bring it to the West, it loses that because our idea of zero is not everything, but it's nothing. And so those are kind of like a little bit of lost in cultural transition there.
Lovely.
Wow, that was way deeper question than I expected. Thank you so much for your input. And that's all for today. Although I wish we could keep doing this more, but that's all for today. I would like to give a big thank you to our special guest speakers, Tim, Deborah, Darren, and Zach, for sharing their expertise. For the upcoming information of the future episode, please subscribe to our channel or check out our social media and our newsletter links in the description box below. Finally, before you go, please fill out a quick survey and tell us what topics you're interested in for a future episode. You can find a link in the description box as well. Thank you again for joining us today. Hope to see you at the next episode. Bye. バイバイ。
Saraba!
さらばー